In 1929, the murder of 7 members and associates of the Chicago North Side Gang that occurred on St. Valentine's Day. This crime later became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The men were gathered at Lincoln Park Garage on the morning of that day. They were lined up against the wall and shot by 4 unknown assailants who were dressed to look like policemen. The incident resulted from a struggle to control organized crime in the city during the Prohibition era between the Irish Northsiders, headed by George Bugs Morgan, and their counterparts, the Italian Southside Gang, led by Al Capone. The perpetrators of this crime have never conclusively been identified, but former members of the Egan Rats gang working for Al Capone were suspected of playing a very significant role, since they were members of the Chicago Police Department who could have gotten uniforms for Al Capone's gang, and they allegedly wanted revenge for a killing of a police officer's son. Thursday, February 14th, 1929, 10:30 a.m. on St. Valentine's Day. 7 men were murdered at the garage at 12,122 North Clark Street in Lincoln Park, a neighborhood of Chicago's North Side. They were shot by 4 men using weapons that included 2 Tommy submachine guns and 2 shotguns. 2 of the shooters were dressed as uninformed policemen, while the other 2 shooters wore suits, ties, overcoats, and hats. The witnesses saw the fake policemen leading the other men at gunpoint out of the garage after the shooting. The victims of this crime included 7 people, 5 of which were members of George Bugs Morgan's North Side Gang. Morgan's second-in-command and brother-in-law, Albert Kalek, alias was James Clark, was killed along with Adam Heyer, the gang's bookkeeper and business manager. There was also Albert Winshank, who managed several cleaning operations and drying operations for Morgan, and gang enforcers Frank Gunsberg and Peter Gunsberg. 2 collectors were also shot: Reinhard H. Schwimmer, a former octician-turned-gambler and gang associate, and John May, an occasional mechanic for the Morgan gang. Later that day, however, the real Chicago police officers arrived at the scene. They arrived to find victim Frank Gunsberg was still alive. After finding him alive, he was taken to a hospital, at which the doctor stabilized him for a short time, and when he was stabilized, the police tried to question him. The doctors concluded that he had suffered 14 bullet wounds. When the police asked him who did it, he replied, "No one shot me." 3 hours later, he would die from failures in his body due to the bullet wounds. Al Capone was widely assumed to have been responsible for ordering the hit in 1929, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, an attempt to eliminate Bugs Morgan. Several factors contributed to the timing of the plan to kill Morgan. Earlier in the year, Northsider Frank Gunsberg and his brother Peter unsuccessfully attempted to murder Jack McGurn. The Northside gang was complicit in the murders of Pilasquanto, Passy Lorden, and Antonio the Scourge Lombardo. Both had been presidents of the Una Scarilla, the local media, and close associates of Capone. Morgan and Capone had been vying for control of the lucrative Chicago bootlicking trade. Morgan had also been muscling in on Al Capone's dog running track in Chicago's suburbs, and he had taken over several saloons that were run by Capone, insisting that they were in his territory, not Capone's. This could only lead to further violence between Capone and Morgan, and Capone knew that he had to do something quickly. The original plan for the St. Valentine's Day Massacre was to lure Morgan to the SMC Cartage Warehouse on North Creek Street on February 14th and try to kill him. Perhaps 2 or 3 of his lieutenants would show up as well. It was usually assumed that the Northsiders were lured to the garage with the promise of stolen cut-rate shipment of whiskey, supplied by the Detroit Purple Gang, which were associates of Al Capone. The Gusenberg brothers were supposed to drive 2 empty trucks to Detroit that day to pick up 2 loads of stolen Canadian whiskey. All the victims were dressed in their best clothes with the exception of John May, as customary for the Northsiders and other gangsters at the time. Most of the Morgan gang arrived at the warehouse by approximately 10:30 a.m. on Valentine's Day, but Morgan was not there. Having left his Parkway Hotel apartment late, he and a fellow gang member, Ted Newberry, approached the rear of the warehouse from a side street when they saw the police car approaching the building. They immediately turned and retraced their steps, going to a nearby coffee shop. They encountered gang member Henry Gunsberg on the street and warned him, so he turned back. Northside gang member Willie Marks also spotted the police car on his way to the garage, and he ducked into a doorway and jolted down the license plate before leaving the neighborhood. Some of Al Capone's lookouts likely mistook one of Morgan's men for Morgan himself. Most people think it was probably Albert Winshank, who was the same height and the same build as Morgan. The physical similarity between the 2 men was enhanced by their dress that morning. They both happened to be wearing the same color overcoats and hats. Witnesses outside the garage saw a Cadillac pull up to stop in front of the garage. 4 men emerged and walked inside. 2 of them were dressed in police uniform. The 2 fake police officers carried shotguns and entered from the rear portion of the garage, where they found members of Morgan's gang and collaborators Reinhard Schwimmer and John May, who was fixing one of the trucks. The fake policemen then ordered the men to line up against the wall. They then signaled to the pair of civilian-clothed people who accompanied them. 2 of the killers opened fire with Thompson submachine guns. One of them fired 20 rounds into them, and the other fired 50. They were thorough, spraying their victims left and right, even continuing to fire after all had hit the floor. 2 shotguns blasts afterwards all but obliterated the faces of John May and James Clark, according to the coroner's report. After the large amount of fire, to give the appearance that everything was under control, the men in street clothes came out with their hands up, prodded by the 2 men in police uniforms. Inside the garage, the only survivor in the warehouse were Maze Dog Highball and Frank Gunsberg. Despite 14 bullet wounds, he was still conscious, but he died 3 hours later after refusing to utter a word about the identities of the killers. The Valentine's Day massacre set off public outcry, which posed a problem for all mob bosses. Once again, the victims were Peter Gunsberg, a frontline enforcer of Morgan's operations; Frank Gunsberg, who was a brother of Peter Gunsberg, who was also an enforcer; Albert Cadillac, alias James Clark, Morgan's second in command; Adam Hayner, the bookkeeper and business manager of the Morgan gang; Ryan Schwimmer, an octopetician who had abandoned his practice to gamble on horse racing and was an associate with the gang; Albert Winshark, who managed several cleaning and dyeing operations for Morgan. His resemblance to Morgan is what allegedly set the massacre in motion before the real target, Morgan, arrived, including the clothes that he was wearing, which furthered the resemblance. John May, an occasional car mechanic for the Morgan gang. Within a few days, Capone received a summons to testify before a Chicago grand jury on the charges of federal prohibition violations, but he claimed to be too unwell to attend. It was common knowledge that Morgan was hijacking Capone's Detroit-based liquor shipments, and police focused their attention on Detroit's predominantly Jewish Purple Gang. Landladies Mrs. Dodley and Mrs. Ordenson had taken in 3 men as roomers 10 days before the massacre, and their room houses were directly across the street from the Clark Street garage where the murders occurred. They picked out mugshots of Purple members George Lewis, Eddie Fletcher, Phil Kywell, and his younger brother Harry, but they were all later wavered in their identification. The police questioned and cleared Lewis, Fletcher, and Henry Kywell. Nevertheless, the Kywell brothers, by the extension the Purple Gang, remained associated with crime in the years that followed. Many also believed that the police were involved, which may have been the intention of the killers. On February 22nd, the police were called to the scene of a garage fire on Wood Street, where they found a 1927 Cadillac sedan disassembled and partially burned. They determined that the killers used this car. They then traced the engine number to a Michigan Avenue dealer who had sold the car to James Morton of Los Angeles. The garage had been rented by a man calling himself Frank Rogers, who gave his address as 1859 West North Avenue. This was the address of the Circus Cafe operated by Claude Moxer, a former St. Louis gangster with ties to the Capone Gang, the Purple Gang, and the St. Louis gang called the Edgin Rats. Police could not turn up any information about the persons named James Morton or Frank Rogers, but they believed they had a definite lead on one of the killers. Just minutes before the mass murder, a truck driver named Elmer Lewis had turned a corner a block away from 2122 North Clark Street and sideswiped a police car. He told police that he stopped immediately but was waved away by an ununiformed driver who was missing a front tooth. Board of Education President H. Wallace Candwell had witnessed the accident, and he gave the same description of the driver. The police were confident they were describing Fred Burke, a former member of the Edgin Rats. Burke and a close companion named James Ray were known to wear police uniforms whenever on a robbery spree. Burke was also a fugitive under indictment for robbery and murder in Ohio. Police also suggested that Joseph Lordo could have been one of the killers because of his brother Pisquanto's recent murder by the Northside Gang. Then, police announced that they suspected Capone gunmen John Scalise and Albert Anselmasi, as well as Jack McGurn and Frank Rio, a Capone bodyguard. The police eventually charged McGurn and Scalise with the massacre. Capone murdered Scalise, Anselm, and Josephine Top-Toed McGinty in May 1929 after he learned about their plan to kill him. The police dropped the murder charges against Jack McGurn because of the lack of evidence, and he was just charged with a violation of the Mann Act because he took his girlfriend Louise Raffo across state lines to marry. Then the case stagnated until December 14th, 1929, when the Barron County, Michigan Sheriff's Department raided St. Joseph, Michigan bungalow of Frederick Dane, the registered owner of the vehicle driven by Fred Killer Burke. Burke had been drinking that night and rear-ended another vehicle and drove off. Patrolman Charles Skelly pursued, finally forcing him off the road. Skelly hopped onto the running board of Burke's car, but there he was shot 3 times and died of his wounds that night. The car was found wrecked and abandoned just outside St. Joseph and traced to Fred Dane. By this time, police photos confirmed that Dane was in fact Fred Burke, wanted by Chicago police for his participation in the St. Valentine's Day massacre. Police then raided Burke's bungalow and found a large truck containing a bulletproof vest, almost $3,000 in bonds recently stolen from the Wisconsin bank, and 2 Thompson submachine guns, pistols, 2 shotguns, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. St. Joseph authorities immediately notified the Chicago police, who requested both machine guns. They then used new science in the forensic field of ballistics to identify both the weapons as those used in the massacre. They also discovered that one of them had also been used in the murder of New York mobster Frank Yale a year and a half earlier. Unfortunately, no concrete evidence surfaced in the murder case. Burke was captured over a year later on a Missouri farm. The case against him was strong in the connection to the murder of Officer Skelly. He was tried in Michigan and subsequently sentenced to life in prison. He died in prison in 1940, the same year he was sentenced. On January 8th of 1935, a whole 6 years after the Valentine's Day Massacre, FBI agents surrounded a Chicago apartment building at 3920 North Pine Grove. They were looking for the remaining members of the Barker gang. A brief shootout occurred, resulting in the death of bank robber Russell Gibson. Then taken into custody were Doc Barker and Boren Bolton, and 2 women as well. Bolton was a Navy machine gunner and associate of the Edgin Rats, and he had been the valet of Chicago hitman Fred Gotez. Bolton was privy to many of the Barker gang's crimes and pinpointed the Florida hideout of Ma Barker. The Freddie Barker, both of whom were killed in a shootout with the FBI later that week. Bolton claimed to have taken part in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre with Gotez, Fred Burke, and several others. The FBI had no jurisdiction in this murder case since it was a state murder case, so they kept Bolton's revelation confidential until the Chicago American newspaper reported a second-hand version of his confession. The newspaper declared that the crime had been solved, despite being stonewalled by J. Edgar Hoover and the Bureau, who did not want any part in the massacre's case. Garbled versions of Bolton's story went out in the national media. Bolton, it was reported, claimed that the murder of Bugs Morgan had been plotted in November of 1928 at Coeur d'Alene, Wisconsin, a resort that was owned by Fred Gotez. Present at this meeting was Gotez, Al Capone, Frank Nitti, Fred Burke, Gus Winkler, and Louis Campagna, Daniel Strelata, William Pensini, and Bolton. The men stayed 2 or 3 weeks, hunting and fishing when they were not plotting to murder their enemies. Bolton claimed that he and Jimmy Morgan were charged with watching the SMC Cartage garage and phoning the signal to the killers at the Circus Cafe when Bugs Morgan arrived at the meeting. Police had found a letter addressed to Bolton in a lookout nest. Bolton guessed that the actual killers might be Burke, Winkler, Gotez, Bod Carvey, Raymond Crane Neck Nugent, and Cloud Maddock, 4 shooters and 2 getaway drivers. Bolton gave an account of the massacre different than the one generally told by historians. He claimed that he only saw plain-clothed men exit the Cadillac and go into the garage. This indicates a second car was used by the killers. George Brintrest claimed to have seen at least 2 uniformed men exit a car in the alley and entering the garage through its rear doors. A Peerless Motor Company sedan had been found near a Maywood house opened by Cloud Maddock in the days after the massacre, and in one of the pockets was an address book belonging to victim Albert Wenshank. Bolton said that he had mistaken one of Morgan's men for Morgan, which he telephoned the signal to the Circus Cafe. The killers had expected to kill Morgan and 2 or 3 of his men. They were unexpectedly confronted with 7 men. They simply decided to kill all of them and get out of there very fast. Bolton claimed that Capone was furious with them for his mistake. and resulting police pressure and threatened to kill him, only to be dissuaded by Fred Gotez. His claims were corroborated by Gus Winkler's widow, Georgette, in an official FBI statement in her memoirs, which were published in a 4-part series in a True Detective magazine during the winter of 1935 through 36. She revealed that her husband and his friends had formed a special crew used by Capone for high-risk jobs. The mob boss said to have trusted them implicitly and nicknamed them the American Boys. Bolton's statements were also backed up by William Dury, a Chicago detective who had stayed on the massacre case long after everyone had given up. Bank robber Alvin Karpis later claimed to have heard secondhand from Ray Nugent about the massacre and that the American Boys were paid a collective salary of $2,000 a week plus bonuses. Karpis also claimed that Capone had told him while they were in Alcatraz together that Gotez had been an actual planner of the massacre. Despite Brian Bolton's statements, no action was taken by the FBI. All the men who had been named were dead by 1935, with the exception of Burke and Maddock. Bank robber Harvey Bailey complained in his 1973 autobiography that he and Fred Burke had been drinking beer in Calumet City, Illinois at the time of the massacre, and the resulting heat forced them to abandon their bank-robbing ventures. Historians are still divided on whether or not the American Boys committed the St. Valentine's Day Massacre.